Hello and welcome to today's video. Today we are taking a look at one of history's infamous characters, the fabulous Moola. In professional wrestling, certain names tower above the rest. Hulk Hogan, The Rock, Ric Flair. These are figures who have left a massive mark on the industry. But in the world of women's wrestling, one name dominated like no other for decades, the fabulous Moola. She was a pioneer, a champion, and a trailblazer, but also one of the most controversial figures in wrestling history. Depending on who you ask, she was either the godmother of women's wrestling or the gatekeeper who held it hostage. So, who was the fabulous Moola? How did she stay on top of the game for so long, and why did so many women in the industry come to despise her? Buckle up, wrestling fans, because we're about to take a deep dive into the life, legacy, and infamy of Mary Lillian Ellison, better known as the fabulous Moola. The wrestling world is filled with legends, but few managed to hold on to power as long as Moola did. Her name is synonymous with women's wrestling in the 20th century, but that reputation is layered with triumph and controversy. Was she a wrestling icon who fought for women's representation in a male-dominated business, or was she a ruthless businesswoman who kept other women down for her own gain? The truth, as with most wrestling stories, is probably somewhere in between. But before we get into the dirt, let's start at the beginning, the rise of a wrestling queen. Born Mary Lillian Ellison on July 22, 1923 in Kershaw County, South Carolina, Moola's journey into wrestling was anything but conventional. Raised in a large family, she was the youngest of 13 children and tragically lost her mother at an early age. Her father, a cotton farmer, did his best to provide, but growing up in the rural South during the Great Depression was no easy feat. Wrestling was not exactly a career path that most women pursued in the early 20th century, but Ellison was not most women. From an early age, she was drawn to entertainment, athleticism, and a need to prove herself in a world that constantly underestimated her. Inspired by women's wrestling pioneer Mildred Burke, young Lillian set her sights on the squared circle. She knew she had the toughness to endure the physicality and the charisma to captivate an audience. Her early training came under the guidance of promoter Billy Wolfe, the same man who had helped launch Burke's career. However, it wasn't long before she realized that if she wanted to truly control her destiny, she needed to do things her own way. This mindset would define her career, for better or worse. After making her debut in the 1940s, she worked under several personas, but it was as the fabulous Moola that she would cement her legacy. The name itself was a declaration. She was fabulous, and she was after the money. She wasn't just there to wrestle, she was there to dominate, and dominate she did. She worked her way through the territories, proving herself as a fierce competitor and an even fiercer businesswoman. Moola wasn't just looking for her next match. She was always looking at the bigger picture, one where she wasn't just a star, but the gatekeeper of women's wrestling itself. Her reputation as an iron-willed competitor spread quickly. While many wrestlers of her era fought to get by, Moola had a knack for self-promotion. She wasn't content with just competing, she wanted to build an empire. She formed alliances with promoters, ensured she got the best spots on the card, and never let anyone forget who the top female wrestler was. Her relentless determination not only kept her in the spotlight, but also set the stage for a monopoly on women's wrestling that would last for decades. Wrestling in the mid-20th century was a grueling business. Travel was constant, the pay was low, and women's wrestling was often treated as a sideshow act rather than a legitimate sport. But Moola refused to let women's wrestling be relegated to the background. She made it clear that she wasn't just another attraction, she was the main event. And with her unparalleled work ethic and ruthless determination, she set out to prove that women belonged in the ring just as much as the men. No discussion of the fabulous Moola can be complete without mentioning her legendary reign as women's champion. WWE officially recognizes Moola as holding the title for an astonishing 28 years, from 1956 to 1984. Now, in the world of kayfabe, this is one of the longest reigns in professional wrestling history, but it comes with some major asterisks. Moola did, in fact, lose the title multiple times over those 28 years. However, since she owned the rights to the championship and often had direct influence over who held it, many of those losses were erased from official records. This, of course, did not sit well with the other women wrestlers trying to make a name for themselves. If Moola didn't want you to have the title, you weren't getting the title, simple as that. The way Moola controlled the championship is legendary. Unlike male champions who had clear booking structures, Moola was essentially her own promoter. She booked the matches, she decided who won, and she dictated who would get a shot at the belt. She created an environment where she could maintain her spot at the top, ensuring that she was always the centerpiece of women's wrestling. Wrestling is scripted, but politics are real, and Moola played the game better than anyone. Whether through alliances with promoters, behind-the-scenes maneuvering, or outright refusing to drop the belt to certain challengers, she kept herself at the top for decades. Other women in the industry might have had the talent to carry the division, but Moola made sure they never got the opportunity. It's one thing to be a great wrestler, but it's another to be a great politician. Moola was both. Her ability to manipulate the system allowed her to hold the title for an unprecedented length of time. But as women's wrestling began to evolve, cracks in her empire started to appear. While male wrestlers often moved on to new feuds, territories, or promotions, Moola remained a constant, and that rubbed many the wrong way. The rise of the 1980s wrestling boom, spearheaded by figures like Vince McMahon, meant that younger, fresher talent was beginning to break through. But Moola wasn't ready to step aside just yet. Her grip on the title remained strong, even as women like Wendi Richter began drawing bigger crowds and more fan interest. To understand why many of Moola's peers resented her, we need to examine her dual role as a wrestler and a promoter. While she was the biggest star of women's wrestling, she also controlled a network of female wrestlers whom she trained, booked, and managed. Moola ran a wrestling school, and through it, she controlled the careers of dozens of young female wrestlers. Sounds great, right? A mentor passing on knowledge to the next generation? Well, not exactly. Many former students accused her of exploitative business practices, including taking exorbitant cuts from their paychecks, restricting their opportunities to work elsewhere, and even engaging in more sinister behavior. Wrestlers like Wendi Richter, Mad Maxine, and Leilani Kai have all spoken out about Moola's grip on the women's division. Richter, in particular, had one of the most infamous falling outs with Moola. She was WWE's women's champion and had become a huge star thanks to the rock and wrestling connection of the 1980s. However, when she refused to sign a new contract under Moola's terms, she was screwed out of the title in a notorious event now called the original Screwjob. Sound familiar? Yeah, before Montreal there was Moola. Wendi Richter's infamous betrayal at the original Screwjob in 1985 wasn't the only time Moola allegedly manipulated the industry to keep herself on top. Wrestlers such as Mad Maxine, Leilani Kai, Judy Martin, Princess Victoria, and even the legendary Mae Young all had varying experiences with Moola, some loyal, some bitter, but few indifferent. Mad Maxine, one of Moola's trainees in the 1980s, described the experience as exploitative. She recalled how Moola controlled bookings, dictated where her trainees could wrestle, and took enormous cuts of their paychecks, sometimes as much as 50% or more. Maxine's decision to break away from Moola's control likely cost her a longer career in wrestling, as women who weren't under Moola's guidance had little to no opportunity to work for major promotions. Princess Victoria also claimed that Moola took advantage of young women trying to break into the industry. According to her, Moola charged her trainees to live on her property, trained them for wrestling, often with brutal and outdated methods. As the 1990s rolled in, the fabulous Moola's once unbreakable control over women's wrestling finally started to weaken. WWF was shifting toward a new era, one focused on younger, more athletic stars who could connect with modern audiences. The days of Moola handpicking the women's champion were over. By this point, WWE had moved away from the rock and wrestling era and toward the Attitude Era, where women's wrestling became less about competition and more about entertainment. Wrestlers like Sable, Sunny, Chyna, and later Trish Stratus and Lita were becoming the new faces of women's wrestling. Moola was no longer the gatekeeper. Still, Vince McMahon never completely turned his back on Moola. WWE occasionally brought her back for special appearances, often in comedic roles. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Moola, well into her 70s, was still taking bumps on WWE television. Despite her advanced years, Moola remained fiercely protective of her legacy. She and Mae Young, her lifelong friend and fellow wrestler, became a recurring comedy duo in WWE, often used for lighthearted segments. While Mae embraced the ridiculousness of their roles, Moola never seemed entirely comfortable with the idea of being a punchline. After decades of dominance, she wasn't used to being anything other than the star. But as WWE continued to evolve, Moola's past, once hidden behind the smoke and mirrors of kayfabe, started to catch up with her. For decades, Moola had managed to keep her darker side out of the public eye. But as the internet and wrestling journalism became more prominent in the 2000s, stories from former trainees and fellow wrestlers began surfacing. One of the most damning allegations came from the family of Sweet Georgia Brown, one of Moola's black trainees in the 1960s. They accused Moola of financially and physically exploiting Brown, keeping her earnings while subjecting her to horrific conditions on the road. Others came forward with similar claims, alleging that Moola controlled her trainees in ways that went beyond just business. She allegedly took most of their pay, forcing them to be financially dependent on her. She reportedly rented out some of her trainees to male promoters and wrestlers, a claim that remains one of the most controversial aspects of her legacy. She blacklisted women who tried to leave her influence, making it impossible for them to get work. While some, like Mae Young, remained fiercely loyal to Moola and denied these allegations, the sheer number of accusations cast a long shadow over her career. For years, these stories remained whispered rumors in wrestling circles. But then, in 2018, Moola's name became national news for all the wrong reasons. In early 2018, WWE announced that their upcoming Women's Battle Royal at WrestleMania 34 would be named the Fabulous Moola Memorial Battle Royal, in honor of Moola's contributions to the business. The backlash was swift and brutal. Fans, wrestling historians, and even former WWE stars took to social media to demand that WWE remove Moola's name from the match. Hashtags like "Cancel Moola" trended worldwide, with fans citing the numerous allegations against her. The controversy gained even more traction when Snickers, the official sponsor of WrestleMania, expressed concerns about Moola's history. Within days, Vince caved to the pressure and removed Moola's name from the match, simply calling it the WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal. For a company that had once proudly celebrated Moola as a pioneer, this was a massive shift. WWE had never shied away from controversial figures before, but the overwhelmingly negative response made it clear. The fabulous Moola's legacy was no longer untouchable. So, how should history remember the fabulous Moola? On one hand, she was a trailblazer. She brought legitimacy to women's wrestling at a time when many saw it as nothing more than a novelty act. She broke barriers, became a household name, and held onto the Women's Championship for an unprecedented 28 years, with some breaks in between. But on the other hand, she was a ruthless businesswoman, one who prioritized control over opportunity, dominance over fairness, and profit over the well-being of her trainees. In wrestling, the best heels are the ones who truly believe they are the hero of the story. And perhaps that's how Moola saw herself. Maybe, in her mind, she was simply doing what she had to do to survive in a cutthroat business. But the truth is, while Moola ensured that she stayed on top, she did so at the expense of countless women who could have flourished had they been given the chance. For better or worse, the fabulous Moola remains one of the most controversial figures in wrestling history. She was a champion, a villain, a pioneer, and a gatekeeper. And even in death, her legacy still divides the wrestling world. Love her or hate her, one thing is certain. No one will ever forget the fabulous Moola. Well, I'm afraid that's about all for this story. If you want to see more of these kind of videos, hit that subscribe button so you can get notified on the future releases. Also, if you hit the like button, this one will be sent out to others just like yourself. But for now, thanks for joining me, and you have a great day. Bye for now.